Well, when I proposed this topic to the board, there was a little bit of hesitation, I think, because they thought some people thought that maybe this was a little bit more academic than our usual sort of discussion. But I think this is a very relevant topic at the same time. We see a lot of populism now with Donald Trump, and also some on the left with Bernie Sanders and people of like mind. So let me just read a brief definition by Cass Mudd, who said in 2004 that he thought populism was a thin ideology, one that merely sets up a framework, that of a pure people versus a corrupt elite. This thin ideology can be attached to all sorts of thick ideologies with more moving parts, such as socialism, nationalism, anti-imperialism, or racism, in order to explain the world and justify specific agendas. So to discuss this topic and of the perhaps related topic, elitism, we have two very distinguished panelists today. Kurt Weyland, to my left, is the Mike Hogg Professor in Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin, and the author of several books, including with Raul Madrid, When Democracy Trumps Populism, European and Latin American Lessons for the United States, which just came out this year, and Democracy Without Equity, Failures of Reform in Brazil. And further to my left is Sanford Levinson, longtime professor of law at the University of Texas, who holds the W. St. John Garwood and W. St. John Garwood Jr. Centennial Chair in Law. He's been there since 1980, was previously a member of the Department of Politics at Princeton, and is also a professor in the Department of Government at UT. And he's the author of 6 books, including Our Undemocratic Constitution and An Argument Open to All, Reading the Federalist in the 21st Century. So I thought we'd start with a couple of introductory statements from each professor of 5 to 10 or however long you feel like is necessary. Starting with Professor Weyland.
Good. Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for coming today on this awful weather. I was tempted to bring a sports coat, and then I thought it's about populism, and I didn't want to look like an elitist, so I'm underdressed here, sorry for that. And I wanted to talk to you about populism and elitism. And essentially, the way I think about populism is that populism claims to advance the interests of the people, what Carsten says, the pure people against the elites. So the base of the movement and the claim to being allowed to rule is essentially a direct representation of their people. But, of course, their people never rule themselves. They're way too heterogeneous, way too incapable of ruling as such. And so the trick, which is what Mutter misses in his definition, is the trick is that allegedly populists want to have the people rule, but of course it's immediately a personal leader who rules claiming to represent the people. And so you see immediately that kind of trick, oh, with me, whoever it is, Chavez or Fujimori or Erdogan or Orban or Trump or whoever, with me the people will be in power, but of course I will be in power, just claiming that I automatically, due to my deep connection to the people, that I'm representing them and I'm the voice of the people. So Hugo Chavez in Venezuela had that line. I am the people and the people are Chavez. So when I speak, it's the people speaking. And so you see immediately this kind of trick, this kind, if you want to push it strongly, sort of lie, right? It's not the people that rule, it's a populist leader who rules, a personal leader, usually a very strong-willed kind of autocratic leader who just claims, I can do what I want to do because I represent the people, even if I'm not even elected with the real majority of the people as you have it in some cases, including the United States right now. So, and the idea is that one thing that distinguishes that personal leader and allows that personal leader to claim that they represent the people is the distance and fight against the elite. And so the claim is that the elite is so detached and so distant from the people that all they do is they don't really represent the people and speak for the people. You need somebody who is strong-willed enough to push aside that elite, to assert the will of the people and to start anew. And so you see in populism that antagonism, that attack on the elite is constitutive of populism in many ways. And so partly to mark the distance from the elite and to claim that they speak for the people, the common people, the pure people, the people from the heartland. Populist leaders deliberately say qualification, expertise, doesn't really matter. All it takes is representing the people. And so you see, of course, the opposite in elitism, because elitism essentially says the contemporary world is very complicated and very complex. If you really want to run a government that makes any sense and that takes decisions that are good for the country and that ultimately represent the people, you need to have a lot of experience, a lot of qualification, a lot of expertise. Now, of course, that expertise almost by nature creates a certain distance from the people, right? Because if you have the expertise, you see that a bunch of things that people want to do right away from a longer term perspective aren't really good, aren't really feasible. You see that when the people speak, they often don't have that good an understanding of this tremendously complex world. Like you run surveys and you get a majority of people saying we want to have more social services, we want to have more police in the street, and we want to have lower taxes. So you add up 2 and 2 and you say it doesn't work, it's not going to work, right? And so the elite has this difficult task of, in some sense, representing the people in the democracy, but also saying, hold it, it doesn't add up. We have to think in ways that makes these things feasible in a long-term perspective. And so you see that kind of difficulty, right? Because even if you really sincerely, honestly want to do the best thing for the people, you might have to have this distance from kind of the short-term interests, the ideas that don't add up together. And so that is, of course, then provides the basis for these populists to attack. See, here, I'm German, so in the European Union does all these things, they make these big-time decisions, and we on the ground want something else. And so there's a distance. In the United States, the government inside the Beltway, they hash out these decisions, and we don't have a good sense of what's going on, and what we want immediately isn't being done. And so you see that kind of gap, that kind of distance. And obviously there are legitimate reasons for people to complain, that people feel neglected in a number of ways. Elites can get very self-encapsulated and use the excuse of expertise and long-term interest and whatever to do their own thing and work into their own pockets. So there is, in many countries, an element of justification in that populist assault. The problem is, when populists dislodge the elite, they don't necessarily do things better. They criticize, but they don't put in place a kind of government that can do a better job, partly because they tend to discard expertise and long-term things, just like, build the wall, right? Or free college tuition for everybody. And I'm a little pessimistic, because I think while the elite could listen more to people and could do a better job also convincing people what's feasible and what not, I think this modern world is so complicated and getting ever more complicated. More and more issues not only cannot be resolved at the local or regional level, but not even at the national level. Climate change, you're not going to solve in one country. European countries, so many decisions get moved up to the European Union level, to a supranational level. How can people understand what's going on? I have a PhD in political science and I don't understand what's going on there. So what you see is, I think that gulf, and an increasing gap, I think is in many ways inevitable. Modern democracies are not going to close that gap. And so that allows the attack, the claim of populists. And so what I foresee in these modern democracies, I don't think you can resolve this. I don't think you can have the people govern. But I think we see right now is one of these kind of populist revolts, but populism doesn't do a better job. And so you get these populists attacking the elite, trying to dislodge the elite, governing for a while in a way that doesn't make things better, that in many ways makes things worse. And so I think the best, in some sense, we can hope for are these cycles. You get a populist revolt, they mess things up. Look at Venezuela right now, right? And then people kind of learn from that and say, okay, maybe these populists, they sound good, they claim to govern for us, they don't do a very good job. We'll learn from the mistake, and for a while we'll consent to elite rule again, and then you have the next populist rising, 20 years later, and I think we might be seeing those kinds of cycles, because I think the ultimate problem, the increasing gap between citizens and their understanding of this tremendously complex world. They are voting for people, and very hard to know who is likely to do a good job. So I'm pretty pessimistic in that sense that you could close that gap, and so that's why in some sense you foresee these populist revolts, they mess up. For a while people kind of consent to elite rule, and then they get angry again. So it's not very obvious.
So you're pessimistic today.
Today, look at it. I mean, it's coming down hard. So.
Okay.
If it were sunny, maybe I would have a better.
Okay. Well, Sandy?
I think there are a lot of good reasons to be pessimistic. I disagree with the way the comparison is set up, because I think, in a way, the comparative terms are fascism and technocracy. And between those two, I would pick technocracy. The appeal of technocracy is precisely the appeal to expertise, to basically rule by educated elites. What that generates, at the very least, and I think this is one of the things you see in Europe, is alienation. That one might critique technocratic decision-making on the grounds that it produces unfortunate results. Or one might simply say, well, even if one has a benevolent technocratic elite, it's really like a benevolent despotism. The Frederick the Great or whoever, that we will rely on some distant ruler to get things right. And this has nothing to do with what we would like to think of as democratic decision-making. But where I disagree with the way it's set up is that democratic decision-making is here identified with a kind of fascism or Leninism, you can take your pick. That is to say, a leader who speaks in behalf of an ostensibly and empirically false notion that there is a single people, that the leader can intuit with regard to the interests. And so you have rule by demagogue. And that, for obvious reasons, is not anything to embrace. But what I think this debate illustrates is the problems going back to 1787, the French Revolution, whenever you date the beginning of some notion of democracy. We the people, here the people rule, that sort of stuff. The importance of elections. That to what extent do we believe that ordinary people should make fundamental decisions or not? Now, the framers of the Constitution certainly did not believe that ordinary people should make fundamental decisions. There was almost nobody in Philadelphia who had much good to say about democracy. And what they constructed was what they called a republican form of government. The most important thing is that it was ostensibly representative government that was designed to eliminate any direct rule by we the people. Madison made that very clear in Federalist 63. That was a feature and not a bug. If you look at American constitutional development after 1787, and one of my hobby horses is that there are 51 constitutions in the United States, not only the US Constitution, and that legal academics especially focus only on one of the 51, which is the most undemocratic constitution in the United States, and arguably one of the most undemocratic constitutions in what we often refer to as the democratic world. But if you begin with the constitutions that were written in the early 19th century, you find much more of a little d democratic ethos. You find, for example, in the 1846 New York Constitution, the institution of democratically elected judges. That is American exceptionalism. Most judges in the United States are elected. They are not appointed by political elites. Most political elites think that electing judges is a terrible idea. Let me say that I've become considerably more agnostic about that. If the argument is that an elected judiciary is too political, then just look at the selection of judges now at the national level, which is completely political. And I'd rather take my chances with elections, frankly, than give it over to the Federal Society, or, if liberals were in charge, give it over to the American Constitution Society. I don't want Greg Abbott or Rick Perry picking all the judges in Texas, quite frankly. There are alternatives to either election or appointment by political elites, but this is part of the debate. Who ought to make decisions? If you also look at 19th century constitutions, or particularly constitutions at the turn of the 20th century, you discover that almost all of the ones written at that time included some provisions for direct democracy, which I am somewhat unusual in the circles I travel in actually liking. That I think there's something to be said for having direct democracy as a safety valve against uncontrolled elite leadership, uncontrolled representative leadership. That does not mean that I would embrace direct democracy instead of representative democracy. It's also important that direct democracy be smart rather than stupid. And nothing is more stupid than the Brexit referendum in terms of its design. I mean, put to one side whether you're pro-Brexit or anti-Brexit. There are arguments on both sides. No intelligent person, I think, would defend the process that David Cameron insouciantly chose to make this decision, and then the most insane declaration by Theresa May over and over again that single moment snapshot in time generates a decision that must, under all circumstances, be respected. She has become the raving populist in terms of that particular argument. But what I really want to say is that we continue to wrestle with what we mean by representative government. Do we mean that those we elect, in some meaningful sense, represent the electorate? Or is it basically a sham where we select our betters not because they will be faithful mirrors of our own views about politics, but rather because we recognize that they are our betters, and they will better be able to recognize our genuine interests than we could ourselves. If you really think that ordinary people are capable of recognizing their interests, and it doesn't require, incidentally, a view that we the people are one. I couldn't agree more that that's a very pernicious notion to believe that there's a singular people with a singular interest. But if you believe that we the people, divided as we are, can carry on debates among ourselves and make significant decisions among ourselves, that leads to certain conclusions. If, on the other hand, you really believe, as did James Madison and most of his friends, that we are not really competent to conduct those debates and make those decisions, we ought to put our futures in the hands of elites, that leads to other conclusions. As I say, if you trust elites, you may say, well, at least we have trustworthy elites, but you would still be alienated. You would still talk about the, quote, democratic deficit, which comes up all the time in Europe. because you're not making decisions, it's people in Brussels. And you might say they're doing a good job, but that's not anything resembling what you might have thought would be democratic decision making. If, on the other hand, you believe that the elite class has been captured by one or another version of the interests, if you believe that they represent, for example, big business or capital or the forces of globalization purely and simply against the interests of those who are left behind with regard to globalization, not only are you going to feel alienated, you're going to feel angry. And I think what we define as populism today is much more anger than alienation by lots of ordinary people across the political spectrum who feel ignored by self-confident elites who really don't care that much one way or the other about ordinary public opinion. My antagonism toward Bernie Sanders, incidentally, whom I'm extremely antagonistic toward, is that he is a demagogic faux revolutionary because he talks about the system being rigged, but he has never once said anything about the formal structures of the American political system, which were rigged in 1787 to entrench rule by certain sorts of economic and social elites, including slave owners, and not genuinely to allow elections to be all that meaningful. So if he were a serious revolutionary, he wouldn't be telling us to pick up our guns and exercise our Second Amendment rights to overthrow the system, but he might, as Eugene Debs and Woodrow Wilson, for that matter, did in 1912, which is my favorite political election of all time, presidential election, he might be leading a serious debate about whether our Constitution is structured well to produce the necessary combination of attention to public opinion and rule by accountable elites. We don't have that system, and there's no reason to think we're moving closer to it. I'm glad to see that people are going after the Electoral College, but frankly, I think it's low-hanging fruit, and that it has relatively little to do with the most fundamental ways that our political system is grievously flawed. Our national political system is grievously flawed, and many state political systems are in fact better, all things considered, but we never really think of them or talk about them very much. Some European systems, I think, offer models. I think the German formal system of elections, I think, is the best formal system in the world. It combines proportional representation with geographical representation. It seems to be a relatively well-functioning, at least up to now, 4 or maybe 5-party system. We, I think, are trapped within what is sometimes called the 2-party duopoly that I think, frankly, would be well rid of. I think the Republican Party may very well disappear, and it may be the Democratic Party in its present form has only a couple or 6 years left before it too implodes. But we have a formal political system that doesn't allow a multi-party structure to flourish the way it does in most of the continental European countries, and doesn't, for example, in the UK, which also has an absolutely terrible formal political system. And we are seeing right now that the debate between presidentialism and parliamentarianism, as interesting as it is only one part of a debate that has to include the question of whether it's possible to design formal electoral systems that can kind of square the circle between paying adequate attention to public opinion and generating trustworthy elites who will make the decisions that ordinary people are not capable of making.
Okay, thanks. I would mention that New Zealand agrees with you about the benefits of the German electoral system because they adopted it in the mid-90s and it's been working well for them, taking them from a basically two-party system to a multi-party system, which is predictable based on the structure of the electoral system. I'm a big proponent of a multi-party system for America, and I think that if we'd had a multi-party system in 2016, Trump probably wouldn't have run as a Republican. He would have been running either as an independent or as maybe the banner holder of a new party. And perhaps the institutional resistance to that new party would have been a little bit different. But following up on what you said, I wanted to ask, so you think the basic opposition is between fascism and technocracy?
I'm describing.
Okay. And you lumped Leninism in with fascism. I'm just curious whether, I think we all agree that Trump is a populist. Do we agree that Bernie Sanders is a sort of populist?
If by populist one means, and I'm uncomfortable with this definition, but I think this underlay your initial presentation, the kind of politics that generates demagogues who claim kind of uniquely to be able to solve problems and who also claim that they can intuit the will of a pure people who are united in being screwed by elites whom they have to, in essence, overthrow. Then I think there are similarities between Sanders and Trump, though their policy views are obviously very different. But who knows what Donald Trump is? That he's a demagogue. He can't believe cogently that ordinary people really are equipped to rule. You just look at who he appoints to office, and they are the millionaire class run riot. He's a kleptocrat. He's not a serious ideologue. Bernie, one might say, is a serious ideologue. Some of the people in the Tea Party are serious ideologues. But Donald Trump is a kleptocrat who is simply out to maximize his own gains. And I don't think that was true of Mussolini. I don't think it was true of Lenin. I don't think it's true of Viktor Orban. Other people we could cite as examples of the contemporary anti-liberal democratic malaise. For better and certainly for worse, they are somewhat serious ideologues. I don't take Donald Trump seriously. Stephen Miller might be a serious ideologue, a white nationalist, but I think Trump globs onto that only if he thinks it will help him gain votes, which is the paradox that at that point he is kind of ravingly little d democratic in simply caring only about getting enough votes to be reelected.
Do you think Berlusconi is maybe the best analog for Trump?
Yeah.
Okay. Kurt?
So there you see with Trump, you see, of course, my thing about populism is to a good extent influenced by the Max Weber discussion of charismatic leadership, right? These outstanding leaders that people believe in. And so regardless of what Trump is, one of the striking things is that 25-30% of the American people feel represented by the guy, right? That fervent support that he has maintained, that people think he speaks for them. So we can discuss what he is, but like charisma is in the eyes of the beholder, and about a third of the American population, for some reason that I personally don't find easy to understand, they feel represented because there's somebody who walks around with a funny hat and who kind of curses and says stuff that they have wanted to say for a long time, express resentments and all that. So in that sense, I think he really is a populist. He kind of speaks for the people, and the people, chunk of the population feels that he's speaking for them. And so that, for some strange reason, there is a direct connection to a good part of the population. I think that's one of the typical things about populists. You know, we think of Chavez as being a clown, but a lot of Venezuelans thought that he was speaking for them, and they identified with him. And so that for me is kind of the core of populism. And that was a very big dividing line between populism and fascism. It's totally different things. Fascism was way more ideological, way more violent, way more dictatorial. Populists are a problem for democracy, but not in that sense, and they don't employ those types of means. And so I think just to kind of focus the discussion, I don't see this at all as close to fascism.
Yeah, I think both of us agree that a key figure in any of this analysis has to be Max Weber. Weber wrote an essay about 100 years ago or so saying that within the presidential system of constitutional politics is the DNA of what he called Caesarism. And I think that he was fundamentally correct. Charisma enters as kind of a public term of political analysis instead of a professional term, I think, with John Kennedy. And from my perspective, Kennedy initiates an era of charismatic presidentialism, where much of his appeal dealt with his personality. He was not particularly equipped to be president in terms of experience. He knew nothing about the United States. He knew much more about foreign policy, which was really his interest. He didn't accomplish much as a domestic president. Lyndon Johnson made possible the implementation of some programs that Kennedy had initiated. The paradox with Kennedy is that he combined a certain kind of charismatic politics with technocracy. So he was the Harvard president, and many of his appointees, who incidentally got us in Vietnam, were leading lights from Harvard. And he gave a famous speech, I think at the University of Michigan, on how in the economy there are no more genuinely ideological arguments. There's certainly no class conflict. There are only technical problems that will be resolved by well-educated economists. We can look forward to that. That vision obviously collapsed, or the vision that there was a foreign policy establishment led by the best and the brightest, to cite David Halberstam's book. That was in shreds by the end of the 1960s. But obviously we retain the presidential system. We have exaggerated hopes for presidents. We have an almost literally insanely long period required to run for the office, which selects out for a certain kind of megalomania. Why would you otherwise subject yourself to this? And so from my perspective, Trump is within the Weberian analysis, we agree on that, but one can trace its development back. I avidly supported Barack Obama in 2008. But one ought to recognize that his campaign in many ways was a Caesarist campaign. The politics of hope is not a serious political platform, and his rallies were often in arenas where we, the people, were invited to connect in some mystical way. Then, ironically enough, he turned out to be a technocrat. And I think one of the things that made his presidency so either complicated or incoherent is that he did not, in fact, follow up on his alleged skills as a community organizer. Instead, he really did rely on technocratic elites, and in certain areas he succeeded, in others he certainly failed. But I think that that it's a mistake to view Donald Trump as just coming out of nowhere. Which is one of the reasons I continue to believe, and I would say right now, most of my friends, family, and professional colleagues think I'm crazy, that I continue to want a new constitutional convention because I really do believe that the Constitution we're governed under at the national level makes its own contribution to taking this over a cliff. But it's much easier wherever you are on the political spectrum to personalize politics and to denounce Donald Trump, or if you're on the right, to denounce Elizabeth Warren or Nancy Pelosi or whoever, rather than to engage in systematic discussion and to suggest that we should look to the founders not for wisdom in how best to structure a government, but for a model of what was genuine audacity to junk what they thought was an imbecilic system of government under the Articles of Confederation, after, of course, leading a decidedly violent secessionist movement against the British Empire. I don't advocate the violent movement, but I do advocate audacity that we just don't see in terms of thinking about how to organize ourselves politically.
Okay.
So,
Yeah,
can I make one comment? Because I mean, you highlight very much the specifics of the US institutional framework, the Constitution, and these types of things. I mean, I see the issues much more broadly, because you see the same kind of populist revolt and the same kind of sense of a number of people that they feel neglected, and the same kind of sense that elites are detached. In many European countries that have different constitutions, different party systems, that are parliamentary systems, you have, people used to think that populists can rise primarily in presidential systems because they have that outstanding chief executive. Well, then came Berlusconi, right? I mean, you can have populist leaders, then came Orban, and Orban showed in some sense that a parliamentary system of government is especially propitious for populists because they can make so many changes just based on a majority and a fewer checks and balances. And so a lot of the specific institutional arguments, I don't think they go really to the bottom of things. I think you see across the advanced industrialized countries, regardless of constitution, regardless of electoral system, regardless of party system, that detachment of elites and technocrats from the common population. So that's why I think the problem is much more deeply rooted and much less easily addressable. I think it's a reflection of the tremendous and increasing complexity of the modern world. How are you going to govern these complex societies in a globalizing world without a lot of expertise and a lot of technocracy that almost by definition is distant from what common people think, or think, it should just be doable. Oh, just a little bit of will, build the wall and you keep them out. Well, that's not going to work. But that's what appeals, right? Do like an immigration reform that has 3 different prongs and the blah, blah, blah. Obamacare, how many pages did it have? Like 1,000 pages, right? I mean, who is going to get into that? And so I think the problem is much more fundamental. I think in some sense, when you think of it, democracy has the idea that common people can make reasonable decisions, and this world has become so complex that in a very basic sense, you can choose among competing elites and kind of broad, big package of orientations and policies, but kind of really having a sense of what's going on. I think realistically speaking, less and less. And I think that gap, that is the fundamental reason that provides the opening for these populists to somehow either convince a whole bunch of people, oh, these elites tell you it's all that complicated. I tell you it's easy. Build the wall.
Or drain the swamp, right?
Yeah, Brexit. We get out of, I was just in England right now. Oh, let's get out of the European Union and then Britain will be strong again.
I actually agree with everything that's just been said. 2 friends of mine and I co-edited a book that Oxford published last fall called Liberal Constitutionalism under Crisis, question mark, which consisted of 38 essays, 42 different authors, looking at a variety of countries and a variety of topical issues. And certainly, I mean, the book never would have been done if we didn't agree with your basic observation that you look around the world, and this is indeed a problem that is arising everywhere. So it can't be the case that there is a magic solution in constitutional design. The question I would raise as a political scientist is whether constitutional design might explain, in the language of the trade, 10 to 20% of the variance. That ever since I was in graduate school, which is now over half a century ago, there's been a tension between institutionalists and culturalists, or Marxists or anti-Marxists who would focus on economic fundamentals. There's a lot to be said for culturalism, that given a certain kind of democratic culture that includes due deference to elites, then you can have any sort of constitution you want. If you have a truly divided society with no faith in any elites, you're going to have civil war. Again, no formal system can save you. So I don't want to sound as if I think it's merely a question of getting the design right. But I do think that some designs are marginally better than others. Or if they're not, that should be the conclusion after long and systematic study, so that, among other things, you stop reading books celebrating our Constitution, or for that matter, attacking our Constitution, as I tend to do, by assigning it causal import. That you simply say, well, you know, whatever explains the strengths or weaknesses of the United States, or Germany, France, Hungary, fill in the blank with whatever country you want, the Constitution has nothing to do with it. As against saying, well, you know, the Constitution certainly isn't a single factor, but it does have something to do with it. One of the ongoing endless debates, for example, is to what extent the Weimar Constitution helped to explain what happens in Germany in the 30s. No sane person could believe that if only the designers had gotten it just right, then there would have been no problems in Germany. On the other hand, there are serious arguments that there were features of the Weimar Constitution, particularly Article 48, the emergency provision, that helped push Germany toward disaster. My own view, for what it's worth, is that the National Emergency Act of 1976, as amended in effect by the United States Supreme Court in a disastrous decision in 1982, has given us the equivalent of Article 48 that Donald Trump is invoking right now. I think, if in a different setting we could talk a whole 2 hours about emergency governance and the fact that emergencies are always going to be with us, and can one design a constitution to respond well to emergencies or not. We don't have a constitution that is well designed to apply to emergencies. But with regard to what you said a few moments ago, there's nothing I disagree with you that Viktor Orban or the rise of neo-fascism in Poland, these are parliamentary systems.
Yeah. Well, let me respond to some of what I've heard so far by mentioning a few different words. Some of the things that a democracy is supposed to deliver to the citizens are responsiveness and responsibility. And I think a populist appeals to the dimension of responsiveness, promising just everything that the people want and promising to be able to deliver it. And probably, from what I've read of political science, a parliamentary system is more responsive in general than a presidential system like what we have, because you have all those checks and balances. And so maybe I think Trump has been a bit frustrated in being obstructed from implementing some of what he thought he was going to be able to deliver. Now, both of you have mentioned that populists tend to sort of project this image of the people, the one people who just want what they want, and I'm going to deliver it. And I'd like to introduce into that concept the idea of pluralism. The idea that there are never going to be unanimous agreement among the people about what they want. So you have to balance interests. How do you see that fitting into populism?
I mean, that's a fundamental, how should I say that, fact of US politics, of democratic politics in general, right? I mean, we don't have this fiction of the uniform people that agree. And I mean, in the modern world, in many ways, with increasing diversity, you have more and more pluralism and more disagreements among the people. And populism is clearly not well suited to represent that kind of diversity and that kind of difference. So, I mean, you see a fundamental contrast between populism and that plurality. Now, of course, pluralism has its own downsides because, as you would probably say, it's heavily skewed, right? I mean, you go to the interest groups that influence politics in the United States, and it's heavily skewed towards business sectors, and other sectors of society have a much harder time getting their voice into it. I think some European countries are a little more balanced because you have had more of a trade union movement, social democratic parties. You have had less of the tremendous influence of money in American politics, and so I think in some sense, although the United States sees itself as the homeland of pluralism, I think in a number of European countries it plays out better in a more even way than in this country where it's heavily skewed.
Yeah, I think one has to distinguish between a politics of class conflict and populism. That, in some ways, what Bernie Sanders, or for that matter, Elizabeth Warren, may be articulating. Sanders, I think, is more in his heart an orthodox Marxist, which I don't necessarily mean is a term of opprobrium, that society is basically divided between the haves and the have-nots, the capitalists and the working class. And what we have is a system that is basically dominated by capitalists. And the working class needs to upend that order. That's different, I think, from saying that there is a single united people who are being dominated by an oppressor. And we've had certain different versions of politics of class conflict since the beginning of our history. But I think populism is sometimes defined, rightly or wrongly, in terms of a view, and I think here's where fascism comes back in, that is designed to end class conflict by creating some kind of genuine unity of the people. Now, I think we also probably agree that after World War II, there was the rise of social democracy, called that in Europe, not called that in this country, but certainly again in the 1960s, and this is the basis of Kennedy's claim that economics could be reduced to technical disputes rather than fundamental debates, that labor and management had made their peace with one another. The UAW would negotiate with the big three car manufacturers, and there are only three. And the UAW, by and large, had successfully unionized everybody who made automobiles. So it was a kind of American version of corporatism that was viewed as providing a consensus that allowed everybody, relatively speaking, to prosper. Working classes would recognize that we need managerial elites, and managerial elites in turn would recognize that one needs skilled labor to build the stuff. And a lot of people point out that the range of salary between the people working on the floor and the CEO was remarkably less, to put it mildly, than it is today. So that vision collapsed in the United States, where labor unions have become the enemy. And I think if one wants to understand the current Supreme Court, don't look at the Obamacare decision. My view is that big business really, at the end of the day, couldn't care less. In fact, big business would like healthcare to be shifted from a business expense, ultimately, to a single-payer system. That would be better off for GM than for most big business. What they really care about is gutting unions. And that is where the Supreme Court has been an extraordinarily faithful ally. And so I don't know exactly how one restores any kind of genuine civic peace in this country without some sort of revival of a trade union movement, which is different, as I say, I think, from an appeal to populism per se. It requires genuine institutional attention, but I don't know how you revive it. We're certainly not going to revive the big three automakers who don't have to worry about competing with Mercedes and Toyota, etc. We're not going to revive the three networks who molded American consciousness in the world that most of us in this room grew up in. We live in a radically more pluralized, globalized world. And we don't really have the political tools, I think, to make sense of that in terms just of feeling alienated or to provide outcomes that we feel comfortable with in terms of interests.
Okay. I want to turn back to the question of meritocracy briefly. Sometimes people bring up that Halberstam book, The Best and the Brightest, and the Kennedy years, and Robert McNamara and his horrible mistakes with the Vietnam War, and as a way of pushing back against meritocracy, saying, well, it really didn't work out very well. But it seems to me that was more a case of hubris, and perhaps this elitism or this meritocracy lends itself or opens the door to hubris. But it's interesting to me that sometimes in this country, people call a politician a professional politician as if it's an insult. And I doubt that is quite the same in other countries. I mean, do people use the term professional politician as an insult against others?
Not in the same way, and I mean, so.
And how do we get over this?
I'm a non-citizen. I'm a guest here, so please don't take offense. But I mean, when you look at, sometimes so you look at the Chilean political class, and those are people who have a lot of experience, and a lot of them are kind of intellectuals, and you just think like, man, that's high caliber, right? And so compared to that, sometimes, in the United States, you have this kind of egalitarian ethos, right? Like Al Gore didn't go over well because he talked like a school teacher, and people wanted W. Bush because it would be cool to have beer with the guy, right? So the US, so that egalitarian ethos and kind of fiction in the US, I'm not sure, and some of the processes that you mentioned, who would want to run for office in this country when you get scrutinized from like your kindergarten days onward, and whether you touch somebody the wrong way or not. So I don't have a scientific measurement of this, but I don't think the US political system is very well set up to kind of, end up with really high caliber leadership. I think a lot of countries, as I say, it's impressionistic and don't take offense, I'm a guest, but I think a lot of countries, the political leadership is kind of more qualified, more high caliber, more responsible than what we have in this country.
Can you think
So
of any?
meritocracy, it's in some sense kind of strange because the US sees itself as so meritocratic, right? And these other countries are whatever, more traditional, whatever, but in politics, the average kind of level of politician, yeah, I don't think it compares very well.
Can you think of any reforms that would improve the situation?
I mean, one thing is, I think, and then you see, of course, the trade-offs and the contradictions. I mean, this country is unusual in having primaries, right? In most countries, the candidates for chief executive office get selected by parties, and primaries means an incredibly long process. Primaries means that, fairly small percentage of people are the pre-selection of the candidates, right? I mean, Donald Trump would not have made it if you hadn't had these primaries, right? And so that is one thing. So that means, in some sense, I mean, if I want to put it provocatively, you have too much democracy here, right? Because primaries kind of, you start out early on, and you see, I mean, paradoxically also in the last election, the Democrats had less democracy in the primaries, right? Because they had their super delegates, and they didn't end up with a populist candidate, or the one did surprisingly well. The Republicans didn't have super delegates; they were more democratic and ended up with a populist. And so you see kind of the trade-off, right? More democracy doesn't necessarily mean better political leadership, and so. In other countries, just the selection is more limited, it's more elitist, and so, now I'm getting myself in that.
For a variety of reasons, I'm glad we had House elections in 2018. That being said, it's not clear that we wouldn't be better off if members of the House served 4-year terms rather than 2-year terms, and half the House came up every at 2-year intervals. Because what happens now, we live in permanent campaigns. Certainly with House Representatives. Each member of the House, and even the Senate now, is expected, I think, to spend about 4 hours a day raising money. That's American exceptionalism. And it has corrupted our politics in every possible sense of the word corruption. Not only do they have to pay great attention to getting money, but also they're spending too much of their waking time simply on raising money and not holding hearings, not reading these 1,000-page bills, etc. So why should you take this process seriously? Senate, 6 years. In the old days, it used to be said that a senator would govern for 4 years and then run for 2 years. Now that's being shaken, that it may be that senators now, they certainly start raising money the minute after their election. And it's not clear that senators think in terms of governance for even 2 years. I mean, if they did, frankly, one would expect more independence from some of the Republicans in the Senate than you see now, that they have really turned themselves over to their own dear leader in a way that you might expect much more, say, from members of the House. But these are the sorts of things, and this also, of course, links with the idea of campaign finance. We have very weak parties in this country, certainly in comparison to most of the countries you mentioned. I have no idea how you strengthen political parties. You can't do it by fiat. But it is simply true that we have a political system based on political entrepreneurship, that it doesn't matter whether you've persuaded anybody with a formal political structure that you're really capable of running. If you have the money yourself Most of the Senate now is millionaires, and a very high percentage of the House also consists of millionaires. So you can self-finance campaigns, or if you have certain charisma, you get people to write out your checks. You don't have to worry about party validation. I agree that what started out as sensible reform, that is introducing some role for primaries, it doesn't mean that each and every one of the states has to have a primary. But this is where our current political system has taken us, and I think all of us, in a detached sort of way, are curious how the Democratic Party is going to handle having literally more than a dozen candidates when it comes time to holding debates or allocating delegates. Donald Trump is our first president in history, in modern history, we have primaries, who had the support neither of a majority of the Republican Party in the primary process. He got about 45% of the votes total, nor even a plurality of the vote. So his being in office is the result of our formal political structures that makes both of those factoids completely irrelevant. If we were like France and had runoffs or the state of Georgia and having runoffs, then I think there's reasonably good reason to believe that Hillary Clinton would have run in a runoff. But we don't. We have the crazy electoral college. If the Republican Party had a different set of delegate allocation rules, then Donald Trump would not have done so well. But these are the sorts of things, frankly, that most people really don't think about. They're viewed as technical and boring details, but they have very, very real outcomes.
Okay. Well, I think I just have one more question, and then we'll open it up to the audience for some questions from you guys. Sandy, you said that elections aren't very meaningful. Would you care to expand on that?
Elections at the national level are much less meaningful than they are at the state level. That although every state, from my perspective, unfortunately, is organized under the separation of powers system, I very much wish we had a couple of states that had chosen a parliamentary form so that we could see how well it worked. I applaud Nebraska, which got rid of its Senate and has only a unicameral legislature, and it works just fine the way New Zealand works just fine with single House of Representatives. But of course, they're both small, and I don't think that Texas could work just fine. We're unicameral. But in most states now, not all, but states are increasingly likely to be governed by one party in a given election cycle. This doesn't mean you've got some one-party states, the way Texas has been for the last 20 years or so, where you can predict now. Well, who knows what 2020 will bring? 2022 will bring, because everybody thinks that Texas may be turning at least purple. But in a number of states, you can predict quite easily. But if you look at Michigan or Wisconsin, for example, what happens that Republicans took control of Wisconsin, Republicans took control of my home state of North Carolina, and Democrats now control California. And they can implement policy programs. And if you don't like them, you can vote the rascals out, the way Scott Walker was voted out. Now, as it happens, the Democrats did not, in fact, recapture all of Wisconsin. But still, Wisconsin fit more of a certain kind of classic model where a government governs. And then if the people don't like it, they vote the rascals out. And you get different policies. We have a system of government created in 1787 that makes it next to impossible for a genuine government to be created. You have to win the House, you have to win the Senate, you have to win the presidency. These are in different cycles. They don't necessarily run together in a truly meaningful way. And so, Barack Obama, Democrats controlled Congress, controlled the government between 2009 and 2011. And in fact, quite a bit happened in those years. After it, nothing happened. Nothing significant is going to happen legislatively during Donald Trump's presidency. The tax cut was the only legislative accomplishment that Trump can point to. He couldn't even get the votes to repeal Obamacare, thanks to John McCain. And so it's not surprising that members of the Tea Party wonder what happened. They thought they had won this huge victory in 2016, and it turns out they didn't. And I mean, what my stock speech, which I'll give right now, that was prepared on November 6, 2016, is that the elation about Hillary Clinton's election would last about 3 days. And then you would realize she could accomplish nothing as president if it required any significant legislation. Because you can assume a counterfactual history that she becomes president. You can't assume that Democrats also take the House and the Senate with a filibuster-proof majority. So she would have accomplished nothing. She would have pushed the envelope of executive power every bit as much as Trump has if she wanted to accomplish anything. It's not clear she would have been able to appoint anybody to the Supreme Court. And Democrats would have been wiped out in the November elections in 2018, and we would be in absolute despair in thinking about 2020 because she would not go graciously into the night and say, well, I've had my one term and I'm retiring. She would insist on running for re-election. The Democratic Party would tear itself apart, and a much smarter Trumpista would be elected in 2020. Now we can actually be fairly optimistic looking forward to 2020, assuming we get through the next 18 months or so of the Trump presidency. But in all seriousness, one ought not to believe that had it gone the other way, we would really be any happier. We know what we're unhappy about the Trump presidency. We obviously don't know the level of unhappiness we would have had with a Clinton presidency and a Republican Congress.
Do you both see a backlash approaching following Trump?
Well, I mean, first one thing is, of course, I mean, as you emphasized, you're speaking about legislative accomplishments. Now, of course, presidents and their bureaucracies can do a ton of stuff for which they don't need legislation, and presidents have claimed more and more of these kind of executive orders, and what President Trump is doing about the environment and about regulation and about climate change and all those things, I think will have lasting consequences. So in that sense, I mean, you're absolutely right. Checks and balances means that, I mean, this political system is constructed to make governing very difficult, right? But there's a lot of stuff that especially modern presidencies with these tremendous bureaucracies and claiming more and more power through executive orders can do that has a very direct impact on what people do. Then with the backlash, I mean, I think more and more in terms of these backlash, I mean, that was my initial statement, right? That you have in some sense a backlash against elitism that allows populist revolts to arise, and then these populists predictably mess up and predictably don't do a very good job, and so then you get kind of, the backlash against the backlash is that people say, okay, bring back these elites and let them govern for a while. So, I mean, I think very much, and I think that is I think that's in some sense the story of the last few years, and I think that is, I mean, there you have to, in some sense, hope in the 2020 election that Democrats don't overestimate the backlash and kind of become too sort of first fixated on Trump in running and too kind of out left and thinking like, oh, this guy's weak anyway, we can push, very advanced programs. So.
Okay. why don't we move to some audience questions now? And what I'd like to hear from you guys is something concise, something to the point that ends in a question mark. And Joanne, maybe you can help us choose somebody from the audience.
Sure. Yeah, I in the past I thought maybe what I should do is have numbers 1 through 10 and just pass them out, and then it'd be easier to figure this out. So let's go from this end to this end.
All right, so I wanted to ask, because one of the things, there's been a lot of discussion about technical details of elections and constitutions and so on, but I haven't heard anything about left and right distinction. So when you say that both Trump and Bernie Sanders are populists, okay, but their agendas are radically different. One is clearly a progressive, and one is, you would have to say, a reactionary conservative. And so if these distinctions, how do those distinctions matter at all in this discussion? So if you were to consider that in our recent political history, I do agree with Professor Levinson that I think that Barack Obama and also Bill Clinton and Kennedy were technocrat liberals. I would then
I
say
think we know the question.
we had a progressive in the form of Franklin Roosevelt, who was very different, and then we also had some arch conservatives like Reagan and far more to the right, Trump. And so how does that distinction of left and right, or progressive and reactionary conservative, matter in terms of this conflation? This is part of the specific question is, with populism, does that really matter? I mean, when you conflate
Okay, let's ask the
Sanders
question. I think we know.
and Trump as populist, you lose this distinction.
Yeah, I think left and right used to mean a kind of labor versus management, where labor, especially since the New Deal, meant a vigorous labor movement, and management meant, national businesses, American business elites. That division no longer explains our politics particularly because the labor movement has been gutted. And what is so important in American politics now are cultural and particularly religious divisions. So, why do even Christian evangelicals, white Protestant evangelicals, support Trump with 70 or 80%? It's all because of the courts and all because of abortion. For better or for worse, when, during the 1960s, that wasn't an issue, or it was a very nascent issue. Nobody in 1973 would have predicted that it would fundamentally structure American politics for the next 40 years, 50 years. I have no romantic nostalgia for the America of my youth. Gays and lesbians had to be closeted, etc. But that has generated, again, culture wars which weren't part of the fundamental structuring of politics. When we talk in kind of fairly simple left-right terms, where it really did, it's all about the division of the economic pie. Whereas today, that's certainly part of politics. One never should ignore it. But to say it doesn't explain evangelical Christians and the devotion to Donald Trump.
So if I can extend that beyond the United States, I mean, you see that left-wing and right-wing populism have quite different characteristics. The left-wing populism tends to be more inclusionary. The right-wing populism, in some sense, is not only directed against elites, but also against outsiders, immigrants, against undesirables and whatever. So it is in some sense, left-wing populism is kind of one line of conflict. Right-wing populism has two lines of conflict, above and below in many ways. So it tends to be more exclusionary. But they both they both share attention to pluralism, to liberalism. They both want to extend the autonomy and power of their leaders, and so they put pressure on liberal institutions, they put pressure on checks and balances. So not in the United States, because your democracy is so firmly consolidated, but in many other countries, they essentially pose threats to democracy as such. And interestingly, I think the left-wing populists on that dimension are the bigger threat, partly because right-wing populists don't tend to, they don't tend to attack business sectors that much. And so there you have more of a counterbalance. You know, they don't push nearly as hard. Hugo Chavez just really wanted to wipe everybody out. He could concentrate power much more than the right-wing populists in Latin America did. And so I think you see in many ways, on the dimension of threat to liberalism and ultimately democracy in countries with weaker democratic systems, the left-wing populism ends up being more dangerous in that. It's more inclusionary, less hostile and resentful, but it's more dangerous for democracy.
Could go back and forth.
There are some, you mentioned Brexit, and therefore elections or referendums are passé with complete debunkable. But many other places, other examples, that kind of puts an end to the argument. For example, Colombia had a 50-year civil war, and then they had a peace deal, and it went for a referendum. Or Northern Macedonia had a referendum about its name, and then it's finalized. Would a technocratic elite would reject that, but doesn't that give it the finalization a lot of power, and that's a populist trend, don't you think?
I think you see increasing use of referenda across the world. And so now, of course, I mean, I personally think that referenda are problematic because first, they take one big decision out of the context and give it to the people, and how it adds up with a broader program is unclear. Second, a lot of it depends on how you formulate the referendum question. And a lot of issues look very simple and easy with referendum, like Brexit. You want to stay in, you want to get out. If you want to get out, okay, but what does that mean? You know, how do you get out? How much do you get out? How do you negotiate? You see the mess that thing has done in Great Britain, tearing apart the political system, because it was easy to say, we want to get out, but then to define exactly what that means is much, much harder. And the Colombian case is interesting because they held a referendum on the peace deal and the referendum lost. And then the president said, oh, we're just going to make a few changes to it, and rather than submitting it to a second referendum, forget about the referendum, we're going to have it approved by Congress and we're going to go forward. And so essentially, Santos said, forget about that referendum, we lost, therefore we're just going to do a way around it. And so, you know, I think referenda are difficult. In direct democracy, my line about direct democracy is the country in the Western world that has the most direct democracy is one of the most conservative ones, and that's Switzerland. Why? Because a lot of referenda mobilize the people who fear a loss. And so referenda very often tend to be conservative people defending the status quo, and change being very difficult to do through a referenda. So Switzerland is the country that's so direct democratic, and they extended the vote to the women in 1971 because it's such a conservative country. And so the left thinks, oh, referenda, the people are going to move forward. I mean, you see, referenda often do the opposite, block change. The people who fear to lose, they are up there. The people who expect to win are much less easily mobilized.
I have more mixed feelings about referenda. I certainly think, as I suggested before about Brexit, I certainly think there's a difference between intelligently designed and stupidly designed referenda. I think referenda make most sense, ironically enough, in something like the Colombian case, although certainly I agree with the description of what happened, where you have a peace settlement in hand, and you could ask people to say yay or nay, knowing what they're signing on to, or for that matter, the French rejection of what was usually called the draft European Constitution at the turn of this century, where every French voter had received the 250 or so pages of the draft treaty, and some of them actually read it and discussed it, as against the idiocy of the one-time only Brexit referendum, where there was nothing, in fact, to discuss concretely other than this desire to get out. Whereas if, it seems to me this is tailor-made and should have been tailor-made at the beginning for a second referendum. The first referendum would tell the government that it should try to negotiate an exit, and then there should be a second referendum by which the people of the UK could approve or disapprove, knowing what it is that had been signed. But it seems to me that there is a genuine theoretical connection between referenda and your views of elections. And this is why I say that a lot of people just become disillusioned by elections, don't think it matters. That if you view elections as really about issues, and if you say, well, the election gives those who are elected the authority or even a mandate to push a certain issue, whether it's the abolition of Obamacare or whatever. What's the deep difference between that and a referendum? What you can say in contrast is, look, you really shouldn't trust the people to make genuine decisions about anything, any policy matter. What they ought to make decisions about is whom do they trust to have the character, disposition, and knowledge required to make these tough decisions. And we can argue about what that means, but it's very, very different from saying, well, when I cast my vote, I'm really expecting the person who's elected to take my views or the views of the majority into account. No, you simply ought to say that person is the one selected by the majority to apply his or her own independent judgment. This goes all the way back to Edmund Burke in the 1770s, whether representatives are trustees or delegates. And if you think they're delegates, then there really ought to be some fairly tight connection between the views of the constituency and the view of the representatives. If you view them as trustees, then it really is almost irrelevant what their constituencies think, because they've not been elected in order to mirror their constituents' views.
We come back to elitism and
Speak up.
elitism.
Speak up.
We come back to elitism and elitism. Do you think the gap between populism and elitism is created because mainly there is something wrong in the system what we are having in USA? Anyway, in a system which it comes from the ground, from the election side, there is no limitation for what the candidate, how much the candidate can use as far money, can spend money in his campaign. At the same time, on the other side also, there's no limitation how much the candidate or the donator can give to X candidate. Because if there is 5 or 6, half a million, and so on, they dictate what they want. And they have to be obliged to do what they want. So do you think the problem is in the system itself?
Dan, would you repeat the
I was going to say, we can't hear.
Yeah, so I think the main thrust of your question is how campaign financing affects the system of elections and whether we get populism or elitism in response. Yes.
I mean, I think the disproportionate role of money in U.S. elections and the increasing role of money in U.S. elections is a serious problem and clearly reinforces that gap between political elites and common citizens. I mean, I think fundamentally that gap exists because essentially the complexity of the modern world is at the beginning. But in the United States, I think that gap is especially big and gaping because of the role of money. I mean, what Professor Levinson said, I mean, the US Congress is full of millionaires, right? I mean, so how are people going to think, oh, this is my representative, right? I mean, in European countries, you know, the current Prime Minister of Sweden, I think, was a welder. He grew up with a family of working class people, right? I mean, so where you have less importance of money, where you have more of a trade union influence and a social democratic influence on politics, you get some politicians who are much more representative of common people than you have it here in the United States. And so I think that clearly makes the problem significantly worse.
Okay.
Okay, well, so, looking at this gap between elitism and populism, I sometimes feel that there's a missing link, which is how are we connecting with people about their own needs and desires. And I remember Clinton never even went to Wisconsin, I think. There was never any kind of connection between these two things. And I wonder, is there any way, a possibility that that connection could be made in this country?
I mean, this gets, among other things, to the question of whether we're just too large to be governed, quote, democratically, unquote. In the 18th century, there was a central debate about the relation between size and so-called Republican governance. Montesquieu and Hume both said you could have a Republican form of government only in a relatively small and homogeneous society. And so part of the critique of the Constitution was that, as one of the Anti-Federalists put it, we had constructed a consolidated government that was supposed to pass laws that would apply to people in Massachusetts and Georgia alike, though they're, wildly different. And, but then Madison, in response, writes a devastating critique of local government in Federalist 10 and says that it's only in the so-called extended republic that you can protect liberty. But he was writing when the total population of the United States, at least in the 1790 census, was about 4 million people. Only, and I'm making up the figure, but only, I suspect, around 500,000 or so were eligible to participate in governance, because you have to assume half of them were women, and then a healthy proportion were slaves. And so by the extended republic, he was thinking of a country between today's Maine and the northern border of Florida and the east bank of the Mississippi River. We live 325 million people. Into Hawaii, depending on your theory of Puerto Rico, it's into the Caribbean. How does one construct a society in which people, first of all, won't feel alienated in terms of their having any genuine role in decision making, and then secondly, where at the very least, okay, alienated though they might be, at least they'll be content and satisfied with the outcome of the process, because the elites making decisions will be able to balance in some ways the interests of 325 million people who differ quite significantly on all sorts of measures. I mean, this is the basic problem of the European Union. To what degree can it become a genuine United States of Europe, which I think is the European project, as against the Confederation that will, at the end of the day, be a free trade union, but not the construction of a genuinely new political body where people will feel as if they're citizens of Europe and resonate to a very different political identity. I mean, it's always been the question of the United States. We killed 750,000 people between 1861 and 1865, and we usually just skip that over, skip over it. And so we talk about a constitution lasting 200 years. It didn't. And I don't have a good answer to your question. And it gets all the worse when you concede the importance of globalization. That the reason we move to the New Deal state in the 30s is because it becomes patently clear that the economy is nationalized. You really can't have fundamental economic decisions made at the state level. You've got to expand the power of Congress. Almost everybody agrees with that. Some very happily, some very reluctantly. But you don't find many people who want us to go back to the late 19th century understanding of the limited powers of Congress. But then we have globalization, and it's the very same debate. Will so-called nation states effectively be able to come to terms with climate change? And the answer is no. You've got to have some form of transnational or world government. But nobody speaks that way. Nobody within the leadership class speaks that way today. But again, if you move decision-making to Brussels or Geneva or wherever, then that simply heightens the sense of alienation. And the realization that you're really at the mercy of the elites and you have to hope for the best.
So if I can say something about the connecting, I mean, clearly populism is a response to a perceived deficit of representation, right? A whole bunch of people think that they're not represented, that they're not in the game, that they're neglected. And so the question is, what do you do about reaching these people? And it was interesting, after Donald Trump got elected, you had this kind of wave of social scientists, Ali Hochschild going to Louisiana and Catherine Kramer and whatever, right? Almost like sort of on a safari, like look at these strange people out there, and people like, oh my God, no, you wanna engage these people. A lot of them, don't have very kind of benign views of the world and of others. There's resentment and all that kind of thing. How are you going to reach these people? And do people like us really want to traipse through the backlands of Louisiana and connect to those people, or the backland of Texas or Wisconsin or whatever? So I don't know. I think it's kind of easy to say, oh, there's a representation deficit, but do we want to link up with the deplorable?
I think that's exactly the way it was, and I'm just thinking that, generally speaking, most people have certain desires, like they want to earn a living, and they want to send their kids to school, and they want to have a house, and they want these things. And I'm just wondering, connecting those kind of things, which have nothing to do with being deplorable or anything like that, you know what I mean?
Yeah, but my joke is the following. So we here at UT, we worry about third bathrooms. 1 million people in Appalachia don't have a first bathroom, right? So how are we going to link up with these people? How are you going to connect? We live on different planets.
You talked about populism being a response to the growing gap between the elites and the ordinary people. What hope, if any, do you have for education for the people who are alienated to reduce the size of that gap? And to turn the question around, to what extent do you think it's in the interest of the populists to keep education as poor as possible?
So I mean, as I said when I gave that initial speech, I mean, you know, so I'm a professional political scientist. I don't understand a ton of stuff. I don't know how the European Union works. I don't know a lot of these kinds of issues. And so for education to keep up with that increasing gap, I think that would be a very, very tall. I mean, I think the only thing, that was my initial kind of sort of pessimistic line about learning, I think essentially you have that gap that allows populists to rise, and then people will learn from the predictable failure of these populists. You know, I mean, like Brexit, right? I mean, that has sent kind of deterrent effects for Europe. There used to be like a discussion about Frexit and Italy and whatever, and that has died down because people are like, oh my god, you know, these Brits made a big mess. So in that sense, you have kind of learning, but you know, but you can really kind of diminish that gap.
Just a quick follow-up. I was thinking of it in terms of the increase in education allowing people to appreciate, not to understand all of those issues, but to appreciate the value of expertise and not to feel so alienated. Just as you don't understand about climate change, perhaps, at least you feel that the people who do understand it are trustworthy because you're a member of that same the same stratum.
Maybe you're more hopeful than me.
I have a question for Professor Levinson. You said you trust the people to make a judgment about who's trustworthy, but you don't want to make them have a referendum on policy. And I wonder why you think that there would be more reliability about trustworthiness than about policy. What's the difference?
Well, I'm not saying that that's necessarily my view. I'm saying that there are these two theories of representative government, and one of which, I think the delegate view, requires having a certain kind of Jeffersonian faith in popular capacity, and the other one of which, drawing from actually a different side of Jefferson, because he did speak of natural aristocracies, would say that governance should be done by those people with the mixture of education and the correct dispositions. My own views are that you have to try to achieve some optimal mix of both of those. But it does mean that, practically speaking, I am more sympathetic to referendum direct democracy than most people I know, because it does seem to me that if the issues are clearly described and involve kind of clear value choices, then ordinary people are fully capable of deciding what trade-offs they want to live with. And I would be suitably suspicious of placing these decisions exclusively in the hands of so-called representatives. I say so-called advisedly because the impetus for the progressive reforms of the early 20th century, when you see the rise, and it's funny, you see two things occurring at one and the same time. The professionalization of politics, in the sense of the rise of city managers and of decisions by technocratic elites, which is the result of a great deal of disillusionment with ordinary representative institutions. So you have savage articles written about the fact that the Senate was simply a group of millionaires who couldn't care less about ordinary people. But at the same time, you had the rise of mechanisms of direct democracy in California as a way of giving ordinary Californians the possibility of making certain decisions, kind of pincer movement, in which at one at the same time you have faith in elite technocrats and faith in ordinary people to give the technocrats their instructions with regard to certain basic value choices. And in some ways, I think right now, we're being forced almost to choose one of those three. That is, rule by a technocracy or rule by legislatures who are rapidly losing their legitimacy around the world for a variety of different reasons, or rule by an unmediated sort of direct democracy, which also has its obvious problems. So I think we try to figure out some Goldilocks solution of the just right blend of that. But the California legislature in 1910 or 1905 was viewed as the arena in which Weyland, Sanford, and his other railroad magnate friends ran the state. So why would you want to reinforce that instead of either adopting railroad commissions on the one hand and some forms of direct democracy on the other? I mean, these are the debates we're still kind of having. Quite frankly, I wish Obamacare had gone to a national referendum in 2012 instead of going to the Supreme Court, which issued a 5-4 decision that almost nobody takes truly seriously except as a result. But it's not that professional lawyers said, oh yeah, the Supreme Court has spoken and they're really wise and they really know what the Constitution means, and they have ended debate about the constitutionality of Obamacare just as they ended the debate about the constitutionality of abortion in Roe versus Wade. They didn't, because we are fundamentally divided on what the Constitution means. And frankly, most of the country no longer trusts the Supreme Court to be what Chief Justice Roberts rather foolishly described as the umpire just calling balls and strikes. Nobody takes that seriously. Nobody took it seriously when Roberts said there are no Obama judges, there are no Trump judges. Every political scientist knows that there are Democratic or Republican judges, and the current court, like the current Congress, is the most polarized court in history. And I see no solution to that unless you blow up the Senate and say require 2/3 vote as Germany does, basically. German Supreme Court has infinitely more respect than the not infinitely, but has far more respect than the U.S. Supreme Court does, because although politics plays a role, the 2/3 requirement just means that it doesn't play the same role that it does in this country.
Well, I think we probably have time for one more question.
One more in the back.
So I have a question, especially to Professor Levinson, about what you kind of alluded to was the cutting of unions and basically, the reduction of, the increase in inequality perhaps would be another framing it. And do you feel in particular that the so-called cultural turn in which, cultural issues came to the fore much more has almost, as it were, served as a cat's paw for the financialization of the economy, and people like Samuel Moyn have argued that the human rights movement oftentimes seemed to be an unwitting ally of the people who stood to benefit greatly, and the amount of inequality that has occurred is perhaps something that needs to be looked at more.
It's an unfortunate reality that American labor unions historically were not particularly progressive with regard to issues of race and ethnicity. They backed the Chinese Exclusion Act. I mean, to this day, the Wall Street Journal is far more open to what is sometimes called open borders because it provides a source of cheap labor. So labor unions were militantly opposed to Chinese immigration. Labor unions were never very progressive, historically at least with regard to civil rights. And the 1950s and 1960s were to some extent a shootout between civil rights and progressive politics as they were coming to be defined, and the old line labor. And of course, Vietnam also destroyed the traditional alliance between progressives and labor unions. Labor unions strongly, with some exceptions, obviously, labor unions supported the war in Vietnam. Students, or at least elite students or elite professors and media were certainly critics of the Vietnam War. And even with the draft, it's still the case that Eugene Debs was right, that wars are declared by the ruling class and fought by the working class, and elite children were by and large able to escape service. And I mean, this is again, I think, why old line right-left divisions tended to collapse. But a lot of people talk about the negative role of identity politics in recreating the old coalition of the white working class. And it's very important that it was the white, culturally conservative working class and cosmopolitan elites. I mean, I think one problem with we have to spend more time connecting with people in West Virginia or northern Wisconsin or whatever. I'm not opposed to this, but it is, I think, just a fundamental truth that I want to live in cities. I grew up in a small North Carolina town. I left. I have gone back to visit. I'm certainly not going to live there. I'm not going to retire there. And since the very beginning of the country, we've always had this tension between urban cosmopolitan, call them elites or not, and people who believed that farmers were better than decadent urbanites. And we just keep playing these arguments out. So, I think Hillary Clinton clearly made a mistake in describing half of the Trump voters as deplorable. But it is true that many of them have fundamentally different value sets from people who live in a city whose motto is keep Austin weird.
Okay, Joanne, do you have a final
So I
question?
was going to ask one other question. So there is direct democracy where we eliminate our electoral college and have only the popular vote, in which case we would have a different president. On the other hand, there would be representative democracy where we keep the electoral college, but the grand old party, the GOP, has superdelegates. And superdelegates then have the ability to, what's the right word, to better understand who they are electing and talk like.
There's a lot to be said for superdelegates. But they disappeared. And they disappeared because Bernie Sanders, they disappeared from the Democratic Party because Bernie Sanders was successful in portraying them as mere agents of the established Democratic elites. And of course, the Democratic National Committee did not cover itself in glory in the way they conducted themselves in the 2016 campaign. What I thought you were going to say is that one could retain the Electoral College, or one ought to retain the Electoral College, because the original vision of the Electoral College is that they actually had a certain skill set of figuring out who would be best able to serve as president, and there was no reason to believe that ordinary Americans would have that skill set. In 2016, Jeff Tullis, Jeremy Suri, and I published an op-ed in the New York Daily News, basically begging Republican electors to vote for some Republican other than Donald Trump. It was simply silly to say that they ought to vote for Hillary Clinton because she got more votes than Donald Trump. But it was not silly to say that they should have picked a competent Republican. We were lambasted for doing this because we failed to grasp the reality, and it is a reality, that really since the early 19th century, electors have been expected to be delegates and not trustees. And so
And it's codified in law.
the idea that we should return to a world that we have truly lost makes no sense. Now, for me, it's unclear that there is anything to be said for the Electoral College. But you could make an argument in 1787. I don't engage in founder bashing, and I think you can make a perfectly sensible argument from the America of 1787 and certain assumptions about how best to design a political order that the Electoral College made sense. I don't think it makes any sense anymore, but we're going to conduct our elections in 18 months through the Electoral College, and God knows what the result will be, because I think it is very, very likely that there will be a significant third-party candidacy, led perhaps by John Kasich. If I were advising Kasich, I would advise him to find a Democrat, perhaps John Hickenlooper, to run on a national unity ticket against a presumptively too left Democrat and the unacceptable Donald Trump. And then the glory of our political system is that all you need to do is to get enough electoral votes to block a majority in the Electoral College, and then the House of Representatives voting on a one state, one vote basis would pick the president. We came close to that in 1948 and 1968, because you did have serious third-party candidates who got electoral votes. And I see no reason why that couldn't happen in 2020 if somebody like Kasich recognized that his Republican Party is over, but that he could make a genuine appeal, picking the right vice president, to a notion of national unity. It wouldn't be a populist campaign, but it would be a certain kind of national unity campaign.
And do you think the Republicans in the House might choose Kasich over Trump?
Who knows? Whatever they did, the only thing one can say with confidence is that if we think we're divided now, just wait and see what might happen under this scenario. But it is a perfectly predictable scenario given the way we elect presidents and given the particularly lunatic feature of the Electoral College that says that if there's not a majority, it goes to the House on a one state, one vote basis, so that Wyoming balances California and Vermont balances Texas. Even though I prefer Bernie Sanders and Pat Leahy to Cornyn and Cruz, I see no justification for their having equal power in the Senate or equal power in the House to choose a president. That's the only issue in which they have equal voting power. Otherwise, the House is roughly proportionate to population. But in that particular issue, it's just like the Senate, and I loathe the Senate.
Well,
I mean, I'm not a specialist on American Constitution. I just think when you have a presidential system of government, you have a direct election, and the total electoral college is distortion.
Yeah, so the hope in the world, of course, is that 3 states have since chosen to opt into the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. 3 more, so we're getting closer and closer.
Do not put your faith in
No, it's
that,
not.
because the fair vote proposal purports to be a solution to 2000 and 2016. It is not a solution to 1968 or 1992, when Richard Nixon and Bill Clinton each got to the White House with 43% of the vote. All the fair vote proposal does is to say that if you come in first, you get the White House. That doesn't particularly reassure me. If the person who comes in first cannot claim plausibly to be the people's choice, this is why I prefer France or the state of Georgia. A national popular vote can mean 2 very different things depending on when you say, well, it's just first past the post, or it means that the person elected has to demonstrate genuine majority support, even if it will take a second round of voting to do so.
Yeah, I think many people don't know that in 1969, the House actually passed an amendment to elect the president by popular vote, and it was defeated later in the Senate. But according to that plan, if one candidate got 40% or more, then they would be elected. If nobody got at least 40%, there would be a runoff.
Right, and I confess I don't see why 40% should be enough. France seems to be a far better model, or the state of Georgia, if we want to stay within our own borders.
Well, that's all the time we have. Please join me in thanking our panelists.